Breaking news. Britain stands at a crossroads. Behind the headlines, a hidden struggle for control is shaping the nation's future. Who really owns the UK in 2025? This isn't just about patriotism or tradition. It's about who holds the keys to Britain's land, companies, debts, data, and even the stories we hear. Ownership means power over homes, jobs, and the very rules of society. Look past the castles and city halls. The real story is about concentrated power. Landlords, corporations, offshore accounts, and tech giants. What you see on the surface, roads, houses, digital services, is just the beginning. Who controls them shapes life, opportunity, and inequality across the UK. Tonight, we investigate Britain's hidden owners and reveal how their influence could decide the future of British democracy. Stay with us. Land in Britain is more than just soil. It's the foundation of power, wealth, and history. For centuries, who owns the land has shaped who holds influence. Even today, the old patterns remain. The idea of landed power, where owning land means having control, still shapes British society. Land has always been a symbol of status and security. While times have changed, the concentration of land ownership is still striking. Most people see only the surface, not the deep roots of power beneath. According to researcher Guy Shrubsole, less than 1% of people own about half of all land in England. That's roughly 25,000 powerful owners, while millions rent or own nothing at all. Only about 5% of England's land is owned by regular households, people who own their homes outright. In contrast, 18% is held by companies or through offshore structures, which are ways to hide who really owns the land. The aristocracy, Britain's old noble families, and the gentry still control huge estates. Shrubsole estimates they may own at least 30% or more. Some land is unregistered, up to 17%, making it hard to know exactly who owns what. The public sector, like the government, local councils, and universities, owns about 8% of England's land. This includes parks, schools, and public buildings. The Crown Estate is a collection of land and assets technically owned by the monarch, but managed for the country. In 2023, its portfolio was worth nearly £16 billion, with most profits going to the Treasury. The Crown Estate owns prime real estate in central London, plus about 116,000 hectares of farmland, forests, and minerals, and more than half of the UK's coastline and foreshore. These numbers show that land, still the anchor of wealth and power, remains tightly held. Most people have little or no stake, even in the places they live or work. Offshore ownership means land is held by companies based in other countries, often for secrecy or tax reasons. A significant share of UK land is owned through offshore companies, trusts, or shell corporations, legal tools that can hide the real owners from public view. The Land Registry, which records who owns what, doesn't cover about 17% of land in England and Wales. Much of this is likely held by historic estates that have never changed hands. Some of the largest estates have stayed in the same families for generations, avoiding registration and keeping ownership details private. So, the full picture of who owns Britain's land is still partly hidden, even from Parliament or researchers. Why does this matter? Owning land isn't just about money. It means having a say over how land is used, what gets built, and how the environment is managed. When land is concentrated in a few hands, it affects housing, rent, and who gets access to green spaces, farms, and resources. Because land can't be moved, it's harder to hide from reform. Taxes, transparency laws, and changes to land rights can all be powerful tools for change. Imagine the City of London, a place where glass towers and ancient streets meet. Here, the real power in Britain has shifted from the land beneath our feet to the companies and financial networks that shape our daily lives. In the past, owning land meant owning power. Today, it's the corporations, banks, tech giants, investment funds that hold the keys. Their decisions ripple out, affecting jobs, homes, and even the price of your morning coffee. When you hear quoted shares, think of tiny pieces of big companies, like owning a slice of a giant pie. These shares are bought and sold every day on the stock market, shaping who really calls the shots. Picture a massive pot of money, trillions of pounds, spread across thousands of companies. But most of these shares aren't owned by everyday Brits. Instead, they're held by investors from around the world who can influence what happens in boardrooms far from home. Imagine a tug of war, but the rope is British companies, and the strongest pullers are often overseas investors. Their growing influence means decisions about British jobs and industries are made in boardrooms from New York to Singapore. Meanwhile, the average person in the UK owns just a small fraction of these companies. For most, the stock market feels distant, something for the wealthy or for pension funds, not for ordinary families. Pension funds and insurance companies once played a big role, investing on behalf of millions. But over time, their share has shrunk, leaving more control in the hands of global investors and giant funds. The result? The fate of the UK's biggest companies and the people who work for them often depends on decisions made by investors who may never set foot in Britain. A handful of powerful investors, think of them as the captains of industry, can steer entire companies with just a few big moves. In the FTSE 100, just a few top shareholders can control nearly half the value of the market. It's like a chess game where only a few players have most of the pieces. Many of these big players are giant investment firms based in the US. Even if some British investors benefit, the real power often sits thousands of miles away. Over the decades, British ownership of its own companies has faded. Today, more shares are held by outsiders than ever before. A dramatic shift from the past. In the early 1980s, most UK shares were owned by people and institutions here at home. Now, less than half are. The rest? Scattered across the globe. This means that decisions about jobs, pay, and company direction are shaped by the priorities of global funds, not always by what's best for British workers or communities. Now, let's talk about privatization. Since the 1980s, many public services, like water, rail, and energy, were sold off to private companies. It was like selling the family silver to pay the bills. These once public assets are now run for profit, often by international investors. The money from the sales helped the government short-term, but the long-term control and profits moved into private hands, far from public oversight. So the trains you ride, the water you drink, the power you use, many are now controlled by shareholders, not the public. Their main goal? Maximizing returns, not always public good. But ownership isn't always the same as control. Boards, regulations, and rules can limit what shareholders do, sometimes. Some companies, especially family-run or private firms, aren't part of this global trading game. But for the giants, it's the big investors who set the agenda. Still, the web of institutional investors, cross-ownership, and global funds means that a handful of players can shape the future of entire industries. In today's Britain, corporate and financial ownership is like a game of chess played on a global board. The moves made in distant cities can change lives here at home, often without most of us even noticing. Debt, credit, and government borrowing shape the lives of everyone in Britain, whether you realize it or not. When the UK government needs money, it borrows by selling IOUs called gilts, basically promises to pay back with interest. Today, about a quarter of these gilts are owned by investors overseas. That means foreign banks, funds, and even other governments have a big say in the UK's finances. If these investors lose confidence, they can demand higher interest or pull their money out, making it more expensive for Britain to borrow. This dependence on global money markets means the UK's budget, and even policies, can be influenced by decisions made far from home. When markets get nervous, money can leave quickly. That can push up borrowing costs for the government, and sometimes force sudden changes in policy. The Bank of England used to publish detailed lists of who owns government debt, but now much of it is hidden behind big institutions and funds. The public sector, everything from the NHS to local councils, owes more than it owns. In plain terms, the government's debts are almost double its assets. This means the government must keep borrowing to pay for services, salaries, and infrastructure. The big question, who is lending and what do they expect in return? For ordinary people, debt is personal too. Mortgages, credit cards, and loans decide who can buy a home, start a business, or just get by. A mortgage is simply a long-term loan to buy a house, but it also means the bank partly owns your home until you pay it off. If you miss payments, the lender can take your home. This power shapes who gets to own property and who stays renting. So private credit, like mortgages and loans, gives banks and lenders real influence over everyday life. Even public infrastructure, like hospitals, schools, and roads, is often built with private money, through long-term contracts called public-private partnerships. These deals mean private companies build and sometimes run public services, getting paid back over decades. That can shift control away from the public and sometimes even overseas. When things go wrong, financial markets can force governments to change course, fast. In 2022, a sudden loss of confidence in government policy sent borrowing costs soaring, forcing a U-turn in just days. In the end, the power of creditors, banks, and global investors sets real limits on what governments and citizens can do with their money. Chapter 4: Data and Digital Infrastructure, the new battleground for power and control in Britain. Imagine the cloud as giant warehouses full of computers, data centers, run by companies like Amazon, Microsoft, and Google. Most of Britain's digital life flows through these invisible hubs. When you use your phone, pay a bill, or visit the doctor, your information often travels through these platforms. Even the NHS and government offices rely on private tech giants to store and process sensitive data. This dependency gives tech companies enormous influence, almost like a digital government. They set the rules for privacy, access, and even what services work or fail. Once a system is built around a company's platform, switching becomes hard and expensive. This is called lock-in. Governments and citizens can get stuck, unable to move or change providers easily. But it's not just about infrastructure. The real gold is data: your clicks, searches, movements, and habits. Companies collect and analyze this to predict and influence what you do next. This is what Harvard professor Shoshana Zuboff calls surveillance capitalism, where your behavior becomes a product, sold to advertisers and used to shape your choices, often without you realizing. In the UK, a handful of companies shape what you see online, what news reaches you, and even how you're targeted for ads or political messages. Even the physical cables, data centers, and internet switches are often owned by foreign firms. Whoever owns these controls the digital arteries of the nation. In the 21st century, data and digital infrastructure are as vital as land or money. The question is, who owns the code, the cables, and the cloud, and what does that mean for Britain's future? Every day, the news you read, the radio you hear, and the stories you see online are shaped by just a handful of powerful companies. In Britain, a few major players dominate print, broadcast, and digital media, deciding what headlines make it to your breakfast table and which voices fill your living room. For example, just 3 companies, DMG Media, News UK, and Reach, control nearly all national newspaper circulation. Their front pages set the tone for public debate. The same names dominate online news too, reaching millions through websites and apps, shaping what stories trend and which are buried. Local news isn't immune. 2 companies, NewsQuest and National World, own over half of local papers and news sites, deciding what's reported in your town. On the radio, 3 firms, Bauer, Global, and News Broadcasting, control most of what you hear, from morning shows to breaking news. Online, it's even more concentrated. Google handles almost all UK searches, while Google and Meta together take most digital ad spending, deciding what you find and what finds you. This concentration means a few boardrooms have the power to set the national agenda, amplify some voices, and silence others. Scholars warn that when elites control both capital and culture, they can shape public opinion, normalize inequality, and legitimize their own power. The stories you see, the issues you hear debated, and the voices that reach you are all filtered by these concentrated networks, often without you noticing. On digital platforms, algorithms decide which stories go viral and which disappear. Choices made by a handful of tech giants, not by the public. When so much power over information is held by so few, it shapes not just what we know, but how we see ourselves and our society. Chapter 6: Inequality, Mobility, and Who Gets Ahead in Britain. Let's start with household wealth. That means everything a family owns, like homes, savings, pensions, and valuables, minus what they owe. According to the Commons Library and the Office for National Statistics, the typical household in Great Britain had about $294,000 in total wealth between 2020 and 2022. But wealth isn't just money in the bank. About 40% is property, 35% is private pensions, 14% is financial assets, and 10% is things like cars or jewelry. Now, let's talk about the Gini coefficient. It's a number between 0 and 1 that measures inequality. 0 means everyone has the same. 1 means one person has everything. For wealth in Britain, the Gini is about 0.59, much higher than for income, which is about 0.35. That means wealth is far more unevenly spread than paychecks. For example, the richest 10% of households have at least $1.2 million each, while the poorest 10% have less than $17,000. That's a huge gap. The top 1% alone hold at least 10% of all wealth, but some experts say it could be as high as 20 to 23%, since the very richest often hide assets. So, what does this mean for everyday life? Imagine two children. One grows up in a wealthy family, the other in a family with little savings. The first has access to better schools, networks, and maybe help buying a home. The second faces more barriers. This is what we call upward mobility, the chance to move up in life. In the UK, that chance is shrinking. Studies show that where you start in life, your family's wealth, your postcode, your school, matters more than ever for where you end up. Wealth concentration isn't just a number. It shapes who gets ahead, who gets left behind, and how fair our society really is. Imagine a Britain where owning a home isn't just a dream for the lucky few, but a real possibility for everyone. Today, too many young people find themselves locked out, watching prices rise while wages stand still. But it doesn't have to stay this way. What if we made it easier for first-time buyers, by supporting affordable housing and making sure empty homes are put to use? In places like Scotland, community land trusts have helped local people buy land together, turning abandoned lots into thriving neighborhoods. Inheritance and rising property values have given older generations a head start. But by reforming inheritance taxes and encouraging fairer wealth sharing, we can help level the playing field. So your future isn't decided by your family's past. Real change also means making sure everyone has a fair shot at success. That means investing in great schools, apprenticeships, and public transport. So where you're born doesn't decide where you end up. Across the country, activists and local leaders are already making a difference, campaigning for transparency in land ownership, fighting for affordable rents, and building new models of shared ownership. Their work shows that change is possible, one community at a time. Policymakers can help by closing loopholes that let wealth hide offshore, strengthening rules against speculation, and supporting public investment in housing, infrastructure, and digital access. In Germany, for example, cities have bought back utilities to keep prices fair and services reliable. Of course, every reform faces resistance, from those with the most to lose. But history shows that when people organize, demand transparency, and push for fairer rules, progress happens. The path isn't easy, but it's possible. Britain's future can be more equal, more open, and more democratic. The first step is believing that ownership can be rebalanced, and then working together to make it real. As we reach the end of our investigation, one truth stands out. Ownership in Britain is not just about property or shares, it's about who shapes our future, our opportunities, and our democracy. Across land, corporations, finance, data, and media, power remains concentrated in the hands of a few, while millions have little say in the systems that shape their lives. But this story is not just about imbalance, it's about possibility. The choices we make now can open the door to a more just, inclusive, and democratic Britain. The future depends on public awareness, bold policy, and the willingness of ordinary people to demand change. Ownership is power, and power can be shared. So who owns Britain in 2025? The answer is still being written by all of us. The question is, what kind of country do we want to own together? Reflect, question, act. The story of Britain's ownership is not finished. Your voice matters. If you found this investigation valuable, please subscribe, like, comment, and share. Join the conversation and help shape the next chapter.